Teacher humiliates black student, a story that will leave you speechless. What happens in the middle completely changes the ending. We'd love to know where you're watching this video from. Drop your city in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with all our content. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. I was only 8 years old, but that day, I felt as if I were my dad's age, carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. Everything started on a Tuesday morning, one of those ordinary mornings you'd never imagine could change everything. Math class had ended, and I was eager to get my homework back. I had worked so hard. "Your work is improving, Caleb," Mrs. Blake had told me the week before, and that gave me hope. I wanted her to see how dedicated I was. I wanted her to be proud of me. But when the stack of notebooks finally reached my hands, my hopes crumbled. "Here you go, Caleb," she said, with a frozen smile on her lips. At that moment, I thought the smile meant I had done well. But when I turned the page, the world seemed to stop for an instant. There, at the top of my homework, in thick red letters, were the words, "You will never be good enough." But it wasn't just that. Below, there was an even more painful comment, "Boys like you don't belong in places like this." I stood still, not understanding. I couldn't believe that Mrs. Blake, my teacher, the person who was supposed to teach me and help me grow, had written that. I looked at her with wide eyes, searching for some kind of explanation, but she was already walking away, ignoring the effect her words had caused. I didn't say anything at that moment. I didn't tell my classmates, or the principal, and, most importantly, I didn't tell my parents. My young mind tried to rationalize what she had written. Maybe I really wasn't good enough. Maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe. Days went by, and I began to withdraw. I didn't want to go to school anymore. I didn't want to talk to anyone. My parents, of course, noticed. "What's wrong, Caleb?" my mom asked one night as she tucked me into bed. But I just turned over and pretended to be asleep. "Just leave me alone," I whispered softly. A week later, the behavior I couldn't hide gave me away. My dad, who always seemed so busy with his cases at the office, took an afternoon off and came home early. I was in my room, pretending to do homework when he walked in and sat beside me. "What's going on, Caleb?" he asked, his voice low and firm, but full of concern. I knew I couldn't lie to him. My eyes burned with tears I had held back for days, and without saying a word, I stood up, picked up the notebook with the comments, and handed it to him. My dad's face changed from concern to something I had never seen before. His eyes widened, his hands shook, and he remained silent for a long time. When he finally looked at me, there was something else there, something that mixed anger and pain. "Who wrote this?" He could barely speak. "Mrs. Blake," I whispered. The silence that followed was suffocating. My dad got up, went to the living room, and started talking to my mom. The words were spoken in tense whispers, filled with indignation and disbelief. I couldn't hear everything, but I understood enough. The next morning, I was taken to school by my parents. Instead of dropping me off at the door as usual, they took me straight to the principal's office. My dad addressed her, a stern but fair woman, and handed her the notebook with Mrs. Blake's comments. "This is unacceptable," he declared, his voice as firm as a rock. "I want an explanation for this, now." My dad was never known to be a patient man. When he encountered an injustice, it was like watching a volcano about to erupt. That morning, as he guided me through the school halls, I could feel his tension radiate like electricity in the air. His firm hand held mine, but at the same time, I knew he was trying to control the anger boiling inside him. I didn't know exactly what to expect and we entered Principal Mitchell's office. She was a woman who always seemed in control. Her stern gaze behind rectangular glasses made anyone sit up straight in their chair. But that day, upon seeing the expression on my dad's face, even Principal Mitchell seemed to lose some of her usual composure. My dad wasted no time. Without sitting or even exchanging pleasantries, he placed the notebook on the principal's desk, Mrs. Blake's aggressive and racist words even more glaring under the fluorescent light of the room. "This was written to my son," he declared, with a tone that allowed no excuses. "By a teacher who's supposedly here to educate him, not break him. What does the school intend to do about it?" Principal Mitchell picked up the notebook hesitantly, and as she read the words that had hurt me so deeply, I could see her face turning red, then pale. She looked at me, then back at my dad, visibly embarrassed. "Mr. Johnson, I wasn't aware of this incident. Mrs. Blake has always been an exemplary educator, but this is unacceptable." Her voice trembled, and I felt a small wave of satisfaction seeing that the impact of what happened was finally hitting others besides me. "Unacceptable doesn't begin to describe this, Mrs. Mitchell," my dad interrupted. "The question is, what are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen to any other child?" I couldn't take my eyes off my dad. There was a tone in his voice I had never heard before. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt, outraged, but also determined. And I, for the first time in weeks, began to feel less alone. Mrs. Mitchell asked for a few minutes and left the room, probably to look for Mrs. Blake. Time seemed to drag. My mom sat beside me, her eyes full of tenderness and support. She didn't say anything, but handed me a tissue to wipe my sweaty hands. My dad remained standing, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the door as if it would explode at any moment. Finally, Mrs. Blake entered the room. She looked different. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes restless and avoiding eye contact. That confident and haughty woman I knew from class seemed to have disappeared. She looked at me, then at my parents, and opened her mouth to speak, but my dad cut her off before she could say anything. "How dare you write that to my son," he said, each word heavy as a stone. "I want to know what made you think it was acceptable to humiliate a child, to destroy his self-esteem like that." Mrs. Blake blinked, her hands trembling. For a moment, I thought she might faint. I'm sorry," she began hesitantly. "I didn't mean for him to take it that way. That wasn't my intention." "Not your intention?" My dad laughed bitterly. "And how exactly did you expect an 8-year-old to interpret those words?" She swallowed hard and finally looked up at me. For the first time, I saw something there that resembled remorse. "Caleb, I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have written that. She paused, as if trying to find the right words. "I was frustrated, and I let my own prejudices and feelings influence what I wrote." My mom, until then silent, straightened up in her chair, staring at the teacher. "Frustrated? You were frustrated? And you think that justifies insulting a child? Making him feel inferior?" Her voice was low, but filled with anger. He was silent for days. He shut down completely. "And you want to justify that with your frustration?" The room fell into a deadly silence. Even Principal Mitchell seemed hesitant to intervene. She cast a stern look at Mrs. Blake, as if saying that she wouldn't accept those excuses either. That's when Principal Mitchell intervened. "Mrs. Blake will be suspended from her duties while we conduct an investigation. This is the least we can do." She looked at us, genuinely troubled. "I can assure you we will take this matter very seriously." My dad nodded, but I knew he wasn't satisfied. Something inside him still demanded more, a response that no one there could give. "What about Caleb?" he finally asked. "Have you considered what he's gone through? The impact this has had on him?" Principal Mitchell hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. Then, my dad stepped forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. "I will make sure my son gets all the support he needs, both inside and outside this school. But I want you to know that this isn't going to end here. I'll take this further if necessary. No other child should have to go through what he did." Those words hit me hard. My dad was there, by my side, defending me. Something inside me began to change. The scar that was slowly forming began to heal. That day, as I left the school holding my parents' hands, I knew the battle wasn't over yet, but I was ready to face it. I was no longer just the Caleb who had been hurt. I was the Caleb who was standing up, with the support of those who loved me, ready to rebuild what had been broken. And I knew that no matter how hard it was, I would overcome it. After that meeting with the principal, things changed at school. Mrs. Blake didn't return to teach the following week. I heard rumors that she had been suspended, that other parents had demanded explanations. Suddenly, I was no longer the only one who knew. The whole school was talking about it. That should have made me happy, relieved even. But instead, I felt exposed, like all eyes were on me. Every time I entered the classroom and felt the whispers, my stomach turned. I was left alone most of the recesses. My classmates seemed unsure how to act around me. Some would ask, "What did you do for her to write that?" as if it were my fault. One night, sitting in the living room, my dad approached with a scrapbook and showed me an old photo. It was of him, at my age, in a school uniform. Next to it, a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Young Student Sues School for Discrimination." "This happened to me, Caleb," he said calmly. I looked at him, surprised. He had never talked about it before. "When I was your age, I also faced prejudice. A teacher said I would never be good enough because boys like me weren't smart. My mother, your grandmother, didn't let it go. She took the case further, and the school had to apologize. But more than that, I decided I would never let anyone do that to another child again." He paused, taking a deep breath. "That's why I became a civil rights attorney. To fight for people like us." Those words struck me like a lightning bolt. The pain and shame began to give way to something else, a sense of belonging. I wasn't alone. My dad had gone through something similar. And despite everything, he had become a strong and courageous person. "You did the right thing by showing me the notebook, Caleb. Never let fear or shame stop you from speaking the truth." A week later, I received a note from the principal. It was for my parents, asking them to bring me to a special meeting at school. I tensed up, wondering what it could be. When we arrived, I was taken to a small and cozy room, different from the cold and formal meeting room where we had spoken before. Inside, was Mrs. Blake. She looked different, more vulnerable. Beside her was a woman who introduced herself as a conflict mediator and educational counselor. "Caleb," Mrs. Blake began, in a low voice, "I want to apologize for what happened. For the words I wrote. I have no excuse for what I did." She paused, taking a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. "I never meant to hurt you, but I acknowledge that I failed as a teacher, as a human being. I was terribly wrong." I stared at her, unsure what to say. I wanted her to feel bad, to understand how deeply she had destroyed me inside. But seeing her there, apologizing, I saw something I had never seen before, genuine remorse. The mediator explained that Mrs. Blake had been going through a program for cultural sensitivity and re-education. The school required her to participate as part of a disciplinary measure. She would also be writing an open letter to the parents and students, acknowledging the error and committing to change. My dad intervened then, speaking calmly, "Caleb, do you want to say something?" I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. And then, with a trembling voice, I spoke, "You made me feel like I was nobody. Like I didn't belong anywhere. But I have a family that loves me. I am somebody. And I hope you never do that to another child again." Mrs. Blake began to cry, and I felt a slight sense of relief. That meeting wouldn't erase what she did, but maybe it was a start. After the meeting, a new teacher was assigned to our class. Mr. Collins was a kind man with a warm smile and an encouraging way of teaching. He knew what had happened, but he never treated me differently. He just encouraged me, making me believe in myself again. My confidence slowly started to return. In the following exams, I did well, and with each positive grade, I felt I was overcoming the weight of that day. At home, things were changing too. My parents began to spend more time with me, always asking how I felt. Our relationship strengthened, and for the first time, I started talking about my feelings, expressing my frustrations and hopes. Recess at school had never been easy for me since the incident with Mrs. Blake. In that space where kids run and play, the silence around me seemed like an impenetrable barrier. I would sit alone, always on the same concrete bench near the trees, trying to pretend that I was okay, trying to be invisible. The other kids, although they didn't mean to hurt me, kept their distance. Some of them seemed unsure of what to say, while others cast glances filled with curiosity mixed with apprehension. It was as if I were a strange creature everyone observed but no one had the courage to approach. But that afternoon, something different happened. I was flipping through my favorite adventure book, trying to escape into a world where monsters and heroes fought epic battles, when a shadow fell across the yellowed pages. I looked up, confused. It was a boy my age, but I had never really noticed him before. "Hi, Caleb," he began, his voice trembling and his gaze fixed on his own sneakers, which were slightly untied. I raised my eyebrows, surprised that he knew my name. I didn't have many friends in the classroom, and even those who used to talk to me now kept a certain distance. The boy, with messy brown hair and large, anxious eyes, seemed more nervous than I was. "Hi," I replied, trying to remember his name. I was sure I had seen him in some classes, but I couldn't match a name to the face. "I'm Ryan," he said quickly, almost stumbling over his words. I just wanted to say that, well, you were really brave. Ryan paused, swallowing hard, and continued, I saw what happened with Mrs. Blake. I heard what the other kids were saying, and I thought it wasn't fair. You didn't do anything wrong. And I wanted," he paused, taking a deep breath as if trying to convince himself to say something that scared him. "I wanted to be your friend, if you want." For a moment, I was speechless. It was the first time someone had approached me that way since the incident. Ryan seemed genuine, without a hint of pity or malicious curiosity in his eyes. Just sincerity. But I didn't know how to respond. Why do you want to be my friend?" I finally asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Ryan scratched his neck, looking at the ground before replying. "Because you were really brave. I could never do what you did. I could never tell everyone that someone hurt me that way." He shrugged, half embarrassed. I know what it's like to feel different, you know. My parents are divorced, and I feel weird sometimes. You know what I mean. I just wanted to tell you that I admire you." Those simple, yet powerful words touched something deep inside me. Admiration. Ryan admired me. Me, the boy who had been hurt, excluded, invisible. For the first time in a long while, a timid smile began to form on my lips. "Thank you," I replied, still processing everything. I think it would be nice to have a friend." Ryan's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. He sat beside me, and for the first time, I didn't feel isolated. We started talking, a little awkwardly at first, but soon the silence was filled with laughter and stories about our interests. We discovered that we both liked the same books, playing video games, and that we were terrible at drawing. What started as a simple conversation turned into the beginning of a true friendship. In the days that followed, Ryan began looking for me during recess. He would sit with me during lunch, play ball on the grassy field, and when other boys came over to see what was happening, he would introduce me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is Caleb. He's my friend," he would say, without hesitation or shame. Some kids were surprised, others seemed confused, but little by little, I was reintegrated into the group. The loneliness began to disappear, and with it, the fear and insecurity also started giving way to something new. I started feeling more at ease, more confident, and Mrs. Blake's words that had hurt me so much began to lose their power. But Ryan's friendship went beyond the school walls. He insisted that I come to his house, where he introduced me to his family. His mom, a cheerful and welcoming woman, treated me as if I were an old friend of her son. We started playing together, doing homework, and even sharing secrets. Over time, my family welcomed Ryan too, and my parents were relieved to see that I had someone I could trust. One afternoon, while we were playing video games in his room, Ryan suddenly turned to me. "Caleb, you know what I think," he said, his tone serious. "What?" I asked, pausing the game. "I think no one can tell us who we are or where we belong. Only we can decide that. Mrs. Blake was way off about you, but you showed that she was wrong. You belong anywhere you want, man." I stood there, processing those words. Ryan, my new friend, had just given me the greatest lesson of all, that courage isn't just about confronting others, but in believing that, regardless of what people say, everyone has the right to be who they are and to be wherever they want. And at that moment, I realized that Ryan wasn't just a friend. He was a symbol of something more: acceptance, unconditional support, and true friendship. With him by my side, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to face anything life threw my way. The months that followed Mrs. Blake's removal brought a quiet calm to my life. With Ryan by my side, each day at school became easier to handle. The emptiness and silence that once filled recess were replaced by laughter and genuine conversations. Mr. Collins, my new teacher, also helped restore my confidence little by little, always encouraging and valuing my effort. However, a trace of that pain still lingered, like a scar that continued to throb from time to time. It was at the end of a semester, during the parents and students event, that things changed in a way I could never have imagined. The gymnasium was decorated with colorful banners and balloons, and the tables displayed projects we had developed over the last few weeks. There was a sense of joy and accomplishment in the air, and my parents seemed genuinely proud as they looked at my art and science works. "You did really well, Caleb," my mom said, holding my hand and smiling. "We're very proud of you." My dad nodded with a satisfied smile, and I felt genuinely happy. It felt like the weight I had been carrying was finally disappearing. However, as we walked through the gym, something unexpected caught my attention. A familiar figure. Someone I never thought I'd see again there, among the parents and students. It was Mrs. Blake. My body tensed up as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart began to beat fast, and I felt the heat rise to my face. She looked so different. No longer wearing the impeccable and formal clothes of a teacher, she was dressed simply, in a blue blouse and jeans, holding a bag full of flyers. When she saw that I was looking at her, she hesitated for a moment, her eyes reflecting a mix of nervousness and something I couldn't decipher, maybe remorse. "It's her," I whispered to my dad, unable to look away. "Mrs. Blake is here." My parents also stopped, and my dad's face tightened. He looked at Mrs. Blake with a look that mixed surprise and indignation. She, in turn, took a few hesitant steps toward us, like someone approaching a minefield. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Caleb. I know you don't want to see me," she began, her voice low and contained. "But I needed to be here. I need to say something." Before my dad could say anything, Mrs. Blake held out an envelope for me, but I didn't move to take it. With trembling hands, she left it on the nearest table and took a deep breath, clearly trying to find the strength to continue. "Caleb, what I did was unforgivable. I know that." Her eyes met mine, filled with unshed tears. "What I wrote. I have no excuses. In fact, I don't even deserve your forgiveness. But I needed you to know how much that changed me." "Changed you?" my dad interrupted, the anger still present in his voice. "Changed you? And what about Caleb?" Do you have any idea how those words affected my son? Mrs. Blake nodded, unable to meet my dad's gaze. Her shoulders slumped a bit, as if carrying the weight of her own actions. Yes, I do, and that's why I'm here. She looked at me again, and there was something different in her eyes. It was no longer the superior and severe look from before, but rather the look of someone who seemed to have battled against their own demons. Caleb, I can't change the past, but I wanted to tell you how this also transformed me. The gym, once filled with animated voices and laughter, seemed to suddenly fall silent as people around us realized what was happening. Everyone stopped to watch the unusual scene, the air charged with anticipation. After what happened, Mrs. Blake continued, her words broken, I was forced to reflect on who I was and the kind of influence I was having. During that time, I met a support group for young people who had gone through experiences similar to yours, kids who feel marginalized and helpless. I decided to volunteer and, she paused, taking a deep breath. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I realized how deep the wounds can be, even those caused by words, and I realized how cruel and insensitive I was. I have dedicated every moment since then to try to fix what I broke. She opened her bag and took out a small notebook. It wasn't an ordinary notebook. It was a gratitude book, filled with handwritten messages from various children. These are letters written by children I helped, she explained, offering the notebook to me. Kids who suffered from bullying, who were excluded, or who felt like they didn't belong anywhere. I read your story to them, and the courage you showed in standing up and saying, enough, inspired many of them. And I'm living proof that even someone like me can change and learn. You taught me that, Caleb. You taught me to be a better person. I stood there, looking at her, absorbing her words. Part of me still wanted to push her away, wanted to scream and say that she had no right to be there, to redeem herself so easily. But there was another part, a part that was tired of carrying the weight of resentment and pain. So, slowly, I reached out and accepted the notebook. As I flipped through it, I read some of the messages. Thank you for helping me believe that I'm capable. I thought no one understood how I felt until you came along. You taught me to stand up and speak for myself. Every sentence seemed like a small drop of healing, a small step to let go of that hurt. When I looked at Mrs. Blake again, she seemed more vulnerable and sincere than ever. Caleb, I know you might never forgive me, she whispered. And that's okay. I just needed you to know that, even without wanting to, you changed my life. I took a deep breath, the notebook still in my hands, feeling a strange weight lift from my chest. My dad was still tense beside me, but something in his gaze softened as he saw my expression. I don't know if I can forgive you right now, I began, choosing my words carefully. But I think everyone deserves a second chance if they're truly willing to change. Mrs. Blake smiled, a timid smile filled with relief. Then, without saying another word, she took a step back and walked away, leaving me there with my parents, the notebook in hand, and a new feeling growing inside me. I knew that full forgiveness might never come, but at that moment, I realized I had the power to turn my pain into something that could inspire others to fight against injustice. And in that instant, I decided I wouldn't just be the kid marked by prejudice. I would be the voice that lifted other voices. At that moment, I realized that my pain had generated something good. My voice had made a difference. The fear and shame I felt gave way to a new purpose, to use my experience to help other children face similar situations. Years later, now in high school, I was invited to give a speech at the school. I sat on the stage, looking at the crowd of curious and nervous faces. Among them, a little boy, with eyes shining with admiration. He looked so much like me. My name is Caleb, I began. And I want to tell you a story about courage and overcoming. The cycle closed there. And as I looked at the audience, I realized that sometimes, the scars we carry can turn into wings that allow us to fly.